Yep, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 10th episode of Tech Talks with Santosh. And we have a very special guest today, Alex Akroshko, with us. Hey, Alex.
Hey Santosh, how's it going?
I'm good. I'm good. So, just to introduce Alex to our listeners, Alex is a software engineer at Google working at Firebase Console. And he's also a core member of NgRx team. In case you have seen me like in previous episodes, I keep talking a lot about NgRx. And Alex is one of the core members of NgRx team. And he's also passionate maintainer of this library at Google. So he has to maintain that library internally at Google. This is what it means. And at his free time, he writes and reviews article at indep.dev. You can just go ahead and check out. There are a lot of pretty good articles from Alex on different topics, NgRx or state management. Even there are more contents. And he also provides NgRx workshops. So in case you are interested, at the end of the session, we'll also share the link with you. Whenever his next workshop is, you can join that. You can also find Alex on Twitter. So his handle is @ Alex Okrushko, which you can see under his name. And you can also find him in Angular and in NgRx Discord channel. In case you are not there, you are missing a lot of things. Just go ahead and get there. So Angular Discord and NgRx Discord. There are a lot of pretty good discussion which I have seen in last few days. So please go ahead and register at Angular and NgRx Discord and be the part of the community.
Thank you,
So
Santosh,
thanks a lot, Alex. Yeah.
for this introduction. Yeah, no, it's a lengthy one. And hey, everybody who's joining, you see Marco, Oscar there. Hey, guys.
Yeah. Hey, Marco. Yeah. Hey, Oscar. First of all, thanks a lot, Alex, for your time. I remember I reached out to you and you said, yeah, let's do it. And then we decided let's do something generic to Alex state management because we don't want you to keep it specific to NgRx. That was the whole concept behind this. And then you agreed. And thanks a lot for doing that.
Yeah, I'm very excited to discuss this topic. I think we'll still be looking at some of the things, how they translate into the Angular sometimes. But in general, it's a very interesting topic in general anyway.
Thank you. So let's start. I mean, whenever we talk about states, right? So I have seen always there is a discussion between stateless application and stateful application. So what's your thought on this? I mean, how you will define an application which is stateless and state application which actually holds a state?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mean, any application would have state, right? So I typically try to break it down into smaller chunks and see where the state lives, right? And then is it a stateful component? Is it stateless component? Is it a stateful service? Is it stateless service? And things like that. So I'd like to break it down in that way. And I think actually where you put your state is one of the most important architectural decisions you can do. It's very. I think it's typically an afterthought. We think of a lot of things, like we start to think of a structural componentry. We think of other requirements. But for some reason, state, and a lot of times it's just like an afterthought. Like, I'll just throw in the service or something like that, and I'll have it call some endpoint and maybe have some state in it or whatever. So when we try to split it up, for me, I always try to think of where my state would be and which things would be stateful, which would be the owner of things, and at which level as well. That's also very important, right? Because again, be it React, Vue, Angular, regardless of whatever, we have a component tree. Right? This one's universal across all platforms. And we can keep that state. Each framework has their own ways to do it, but it's still somewhat either attached to a particular node of that component tree, right? A particular component, or it's somewhere in the global scope, right? So basically available throughout the application. And even that is like, what are the trade-offs there, right? What is the benefit of having everything globally available, or what is the benefit of having something more locally scoped? Should we use one or the other, or maybe both, right? So this is the type of things I'd like people to think about when they're crafting their application or writing their design docs, before they implement things. Thinking a little bit ahead of time, I think it's important. And that would bring a lot more clarity and structure to your work, right? Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. So I mean, of course, whenever we design the system, we don't actually start thinking about what my data, which part of data is going to be in the state. This is something which I miss, right? So just to add, I mean, how you will think, I mean, how you will start thinking about, okay, let's say I'm designing an application, and what will be your thought process that I want to put this data in state, or I don't want to put this data in state. What kind of data you will think about?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing that to think about the state is what kind of types of state we have. And I can actually present this as a very short thing about the about this state in general. And I like that quote from Sundar, our leader within Google, right? Synchronizing the state within the application and the backends, right, is one of the most complex tasks that developers have to solve. And well, in fact, he never said that, but I'm sure he definitely thinks about it every day when he does his high-level SEO decisions. But anyhow, I believe it's true. And I think, and I've seen a lot of examples where not thinking about this, not thinking very specifically about this, a lot of time backfires, and basically people then will be adding a lot of these solutions or state management things. And I'm not saying about libraries right now. State management is whenever you have state and you move it and you share it, you move it around, or you even pass it from component to component, you already managing state. So that's the end of it. I'm not talking about the state management libraries at the moment. So any of the state flows, if that's what people would prefer, they have to be thought ahead of time to prevent a lot of mistakes, I don't want to call it poor solutions, but solutions that lack that type of thing. A lot of times backfire and make it a little bit less scalable, or once you start scaling things, things start to fail a little bit. So this was the state management, and what's the state, right? So and you probably seen it, or maybe not, from one of my talks. And I like this one. And again, I'd like to split the state and think of type of the state, because giving that additional information, if you can place your state mentally in those buckets, I think really opens up a better thinking about them, how you manage it. And so, we do have always have this server backend state, right? And this is our source of truth, right? So because any web app talks to the backend, talks to the database.
Exactly.
Database is in fact the source of truth of any of the persistent data in the end. This is our thing. And how awesome would it be, right, if on the web app we can just get all that state at the same time? But we can't do that, right? So we always have some chunks of it, and the chunks that we get from it, those are persistent state. Then there's a URL state, client state, and local state, which we'll get into in a second. So this persistent state, right? I'm showing on the Firebase application, but it's any application. Whenever you call those endpoints that bring you some JSON back, right? Those are CRUD or whatever. They give you some data back, right? The JSON structure or whatever you want to do it. But this is a snapshot of some state at the backend, right? It's a snapshot. And it's a tiny piece. And we can use this tiny piece throughout the application. Maybe multiple components need this and stuff like that. But this is what a persistent state. This is a state that goes back and forth between client and backend. Especially if you have forms or any inputs, you persist some of the data back, right? If you have application that only reads, well, congratulations, it's even easier, all right? But in reality, most of the applications will have some kind of back and forth kind of things.
Yeah, thanks.
And the second one is a URL, right? And this is very frequently misses a state because especially when you're trying to create those state flows. Okay, I'm going from one page to another. It's way too easy to do in React, Angular, whatever. Just change the page in the router outlet or something without thinking too much about it, or how you pass this data to the new page. It's very important that URL is a lot of times is initially the source of truth for all of your applications. So this is a particular state that you always have to think about, right? In some effects, like, or any logic, how do we pass the data to this new page? And the thing is, that data should be retrieved by that second page that we navigate to. If user just refreshes the page anyway, right, with the same URL. So that flow sometimes lacking, and I've seen this many times as well, where where we kind of, the data just works because it's kind of present when you move from one page to another, but then you refresh the page and it collapses because components were expecting some data that was retrieved by another page once you start sharing it. So again, this is very important to think about the URL one. And then there's a client state. The typical way I think about client state is the data that is not persisted to the backend, but it's still an important part of the application. So for example, here is, sign in method tab is open, right? It's still important within the scope of the application, but obviously which tab is open doesn't go to your backend, right? Backend doesn't care about it. URL does. URL does, right? And sometimes actually URL drives it, right? So that's an important part. And then obviously the last part is the local UI state. This is the local component state within that component, and maybe some of the children. For example, this enable, disable. This button, this component has this component state that's just is enabled or disabled. It's checked true or false, right? So within the component, it has no clue, is it connected to the persistent state or whatever. It basically gets it through the inputs and outputs, basically some mechanism to pass the data from its parent component, and it emits this outputs or events out of the component when it changes, right? So it's completely local. It could be tied to the persistent state. And this is where important the transfer of that state, right? So it's persisted on the global application level, but then it goes into the local one, and make sure this one enable. So these are the four states that I'd like to break my mental model when I start to think about all these things, and basically synchronizing all of this is what I find our most important job as software engineers. So that's part that I wanted to show when thinking of these types of states.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
I mean, we have a question. Let's take a question and then we'll move on. So Oscar has this question. Things get a bit complicated when using state in lazy loaded modules, and how to sync those with the rest of the application. What would be the approach?
Yeah, that's a good one. And again, I think this is pretty much how you start structuring your data. Where does your data live? Right. And as I said before, typically even the persisted layer, for example, the persisted layer, the persisted state, the one that we synchronize with the backend and uses backend, that state could live in the global scope, right? So basically available throughout the application. Could be even lazy loaded later on, that patch to it, or it could live within the local component. So this is something that we didn't have a very, very, very good answer before, especially with the NgRx and things because we were basically we're putting a lot of things into the global scope, but we were missing some parts where more locally scoped data is more important. And for example, if we lazy load a component that owns the data, that data is not shared anywhere in the application, then component store can completely contain that, or even the NgRx for feature kind of lazy loaded can contain these things, and it's a little bit easier to do it. But then if you lazy load something and that needs to share it throughout the entire application, then maybe it should be part of the initial load anyway, right? Because if the application already relies on some of the data, it should be there. So that's what I would think about that. Definitely.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So.
Okay. So I think you described the state like perfectly. We have what kind of states are available, but let's move on to the next question, right? Of course, those states are available, but why it matters? Why should we manage the state for a web application? That's the biggest question, right? So why should we do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we should manage it because we need to understand the flow and how things are used. And remember, if you don't persist the data back, for example, a lot of the times you would just, I need the data at specific node and it can just flow down, right? Because then it's so easy. But then say you have forms, right? Now that needs to be persisted back. And that's like, you're like, okay, I have a service and I'll call something. But then you say that data is used in multiple places within your application. So you have one component there, another one component there that use that data in some form or shape, right? One could be transforming to, just a single account item. One could be, having a list of things, and one can just be true or false, or it cares the data is there or not. So you have a piece of data that is persistent state, and now you need to share it in amongst a few things. So you would typically find the node within the component tree that can contain that state, and then share it in multiple ways within components that actually care about that data. In Angular, the best way is probably to have a service that component scoped service, and then in the components that are below in the injection tree, right, can basically inject that service and get the data that you need, most of the time reactively. That's my best approach to this. So and then okay, you get it. You have now the data that's the same source of data, right, shared among multiple components. But then one of the components, say, has a form, and it affects the data.
Okay.
So now you see you have a state that gets into the top level component, flows down to multiple things, a lot of times reactively, and one of them has to push it up. All right, that's awesome. We can start typing and start pushing, value changes and all that stuff, pushing it there, and all the components consume it. That's awesome, but that's not always the case. A lot of times we want to change the data and click save.
Yep.
And maybe do some validation before that. So now you have an interesting flow of data. Now it gets down, it transforms from the persisted data that is shared into the local state that you can modify, and validate and maybe cancel, right? So you don't want to persist it up. And when you click save, only then you persist it back, right? So you now have a data flow that's very interesting, right? So you have a top level that's shared. You go one to the child component that has a form. That one transforms into the local one. It manipulates it, and then on save, then it only pushes it up top. Then again, there are multiple approaches. Do you do it optimistically or pessimistically? Basically, if your application treats this new data right away as a source of truth without validation from the backend, and on validation you can basically revert it back, or do you want to actually wait and make sure that the data is persisted correctly, there's no issues, and then only share it back, including to that format? So those are all the interesting cases, right, that we run into and are very frequently overlooked. And then when you try to work, okay, I need a form, okay, and then you're basically trying to catch up with that without pre-planning this flow, and a lot of times that comes into the bugs because, I updated the data that it didn't intend to, and it's very easy to miss those kind of things as well. especially then you start, say you have two things that affect that data. Maybe you have a WebSocket connection that pulls some more important, or maybe you have a periodic call, or any of that stuff, or maybe you could interact with the other component that could also change that some of the data, right? Maybe it's not read only. So all of those things can cause a lot of like race conditions and different kind of errors that are you never unit test for, right? And even if you're a good coverage and even that you don't test for race conditions kind of things. Yeah, so that's why thinking ahead of it is very important, I think.
Okay, so how much I'm true here? So what I think about state management is, let's say, it also allows me to actually avoid a lot of repeated HTTP calls. I don't have to make those, because generally what we do is whenever we are like adding one record, right? In older days, let's go back to the older days, like early 2000, where we had to actually make an API call to get the data again. That was the mentality at that time. So whenever you add a record, edit a record, or delete a record, you should go ahead and get refetch entire data. And now we are coming to a state where what we are saying is, in case you have 100 records and you just modify one record, just go ahead and somehow just append that into the existing state which you already have, avoiding the transferring a lot of data to your front end. Because of course, once you transfer a lot of data to your front end, it matters. There is a network speed which comes into the picture, right? So you have a lot of, and if you transfer a lot of data, it will actually somehow impact your application. So do you think, am I right or am I wrong? So
yeah, that's a good point, and I think this was the entire like evolution of the of web in general. Before any URL you go to, you get a new page server rendered and data is there. Like you have no things, like you literally have to reload the whole thing. Exactly. And then all the NgX stuff came in and like, oh, now we don't need to do this. We can just do the calls, all this awesome. But it's those calls could be a lot of times like stateless, right? It's like completely get back, right? Every time you want something, go back and get me something. And then you get into the stateful territory of those services. And then, hey, your services become smarter. You call things. They can see if they have it in cache and things like that. It's up to you how to do it. But then each service being responsible for a specific thing and becoming caches can also be a problem. For example, I prefer my services to be stateless, like most of the time. Especially the services that are just wrapping the HTTP calls. I want them to be stateless. I want them to be responsible for making the call and giving me that response back, be it observable, a promise, or whatever, right? I want them to do that and I want it to be very predictable. And then I have another layer in between. That's where the state management happens, right? This is the one that now is smart enough to call those services to do a simple stateless request. And then within those layers, I can really think, okay, what do I want to do? Do I want to call? Do I have this data and I don't want to call? Do I have this data and time to live for this data has passed? I still want to redo this. Or do I still want to do the call, but I can provide my cache data in the meantime? And when the new response comes back, I'll just provide the updated one, because the reactivity, that's the beauty of it, right? Because you can always just, things are listening and you can just keep updating things if you want to. So all those choices, you now have all those powers. It enables you to really start thinking about how your data flows, how it lives, how it's reused, or should it not be reused at all? Because, for example, it could be endpoints that a lot of other web apps are updating. So you want to have a fresh data, but maybe you can show the cache data in the meantime, or you don't want to show the cache data in the meantime. You always want to make sure you got the fresh one. So see, like all those choices you have now, they are all the empowerment. And if you multiple components want to update the same data at the same time, you can now, or even the same component, right? Like you have a click happy user, like save. Oh, get, and then what do you do with that? Like, what do you want to do? Do you want to hold the new ones because you're already doing this one, or do you want to, like add to cart? I really want to add like 50 items in my cart. So like those type of scenarios. It enables you on the. This is what the state management is. This is where this comes into play. You don't have a bunch of services that each has some piece of cache, and the services are trying to figure out, because services should not be responsible how they're used, right? This is where the stateless services are, like, that's why I prefer my services stateless at the outer level application, the ones that actually do requests. And then I have some state management solution, pure NgRx, Akita, Redux, whatever, be it any application, any framework, they all have some kind of state management solution. And I don't care if you're using NgRx or Akita or something else. As long as you're thinking about it, that's good enough for me. If you're thinking about it, that's a step up, and especially if you're thinking ahead of time with it. And again, some of those frameworks are a little bit more forgiving. Like if you have everything in a global scope, that's a little bit more forgiving at what stage you start thinking about. If you're trying to have a state at certain component levels, then you have to think a little bit ahead of time as well, because that would be important role. So this is where it all comes into play. We now have such a powerful things at our hand, and they're very powerful, and it's very easy to get it wrong as well. so yeah, my goal, my ideal scenarios for everything is to have a very slim components, like they're basically presenting the views, to have a very stateless services at the outer layer. They are doing just the calls that they're asked to do, right? And then have some kind of in between layer, the persistent layer, the UI layer, or anything. Like this is where your state lives, and it knows how to deal with this. You can have a component, component level states as well, but they just be outside of the component. Let component be simple. Let component just be inputs outputs kind of thing, or service calls and listening for reactive properties, like that kind of thing. It'll become so much easier to live, breathe, and also maintain and scale, right? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, I've been there multiple times. If I get into the 400 or 500 line component, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 line components, and even if I created it for some weird reason, or 3 months in, I would need hours to understand what's happening there, right? If you have things slim, because again, we read this a lot more than we write. If it's slim and simpler, right, we can at least try to understand, okay, this is using this information, good. And we just, in our head, it's like, okay, this is a box that we don't have to worry about. We know inputs, outputs of this box. Let's put this box aside. Now let's see how the logic is handled for this box, right? Instead of trying to wire all of these, especially if you have like callbacks of functions that call some functions that call some function, and then it's just like every time you go deeper in the function, you have to keep it in your memory, and our memory is our RAM is not that good. We can only keep like so much info, especially when you start digging deeper. That's it, you're lost, and you have to take a break and come back, or maybe start writing it down, which is still not a bad idea, even if you do it the proper way. But I think this is where it's important. What do you think?
Yep, agreed. So let's take some questions, and then we'll move to the discussion. So Vijay has this question: how does GraphQL and NgRx goes together? While GraphQL takes care of server state, NgRx for client state, what is the recommendation when GraphQL is used?
Yeah, it's a good one. By the way, hey Shirkan, hey Lars, our fellow in-depth members. So this is a frequent one. So one thing ahead of time, I don't use GraphQL. I know it's very powerful. I don't use it not because I don't want to. It's just because the services that I work with are very much RESTful, and there's no GraphQL layer in between. I hear GraphQL is really powerful. I hear it's great. I understand what it does in a nutshell. I understand that it has its own caching layer and stuff like that as well. That's all great. And if that's all works for you, awesome, right? And NgRx can, and again, it's a similar question I get about the Firebase as well, because Firebase not really, but with the queries, it's not GraphQL, but it's still a reactive source that you can basically craft whatever you want to do. And the same, like, what do you do with NgRx in this? It all depends. Like, do I want to make a call every time, or can I have that data somehow, either normalize it or whatever I want to do with this, and then spread it through my application. So NgRx could be that layer. And again, if it's not needed, if you feel like GraphQL is completely covering all your use cases, like if there is no need for it, like you don't see the need, and you feel like everything's happening is quite comfortable, go ahead, no problem. I typically try to abstract the persisted layer for a little bit. First of all, why I do it? Depending how long your application lives as well. For example, right now I'm working on the Firebase console, and that application, it's been around since 6 years. It's probably was rewritten internally multiple times already. There are new backends. There are old backends. They're migrating from one backend to another, and all of these things, even for the same kind of services. For example, I'm working now like in console notification and preferences. And we are moving from older service that's getting deprecated to a new one, right? And my app has to stay looking the same and feel the same for now while we're migrating. And then there'll be some new improvements which the new server provides. So while we're migrating, right, do I want to touch every component possible and how the data? No, I want completely separate it, right? So there are multiple ways to do it. NgRx is one of them as well. If your new service also does the GraphQL, maybe it'll work for you. So those are all the things. There are multiple inputs that have to go into your decision. There's no, oh, this is good and this is bad kind of answers. Unfortunately, I mean, it's such because the answer is typically like, it depends, right? But it's not depends because it's like, oh, I don't want to answer it. It depends because it really depends. And there are so many inputs for this. For example, in the NgXIO site, in the component store, where I put the comparison between store and component store, before even comparing those two, I have like basically the list of items that I'd like to think about, which one to use, where to use, and what I can do. And there's like 7 or 8 questions, maybe more. And this is the ones that I'd like to think about when I'm doing any component store things. I can probably share my screen. Do it quickly. So docs, state, component store, and this one. These are the things that I'd like to think about, like the size of application, how interconnected it is, the depths of the component trees, state ownership, right? Could be clear, separate, not like lifespan of the state, business requirements and how they change the lifespan of the application, like how long you plan this application to live at all. And again, this is like a backend APIs is one of them as well. This is basically, is it like GraphQL or like how much you can influence this stuff. So this is the stuff that I'd like to think about. Yeah. So GraphQL is great. I hear it's great. I don't have a choice. I don't have a choice to use it right now, no chance to use it right now. So yeah, it's probably a longer answer, but I think it's basically, it should highlight some of the things, I hope.
Okay. So Nikhil has another question. If we are adding some data to backend, should we recall HTTP for getting data again, or it is okay to just use new data to render directly, skipping and recall to backend?
Yeah, and I touched on it a little bit briefly already, but again, it depends. How much of how dynamic is that data? Is it okay for your user? Maybe you need to recall every time. Maybe you can optimistically show and recall. Maybe you don't want to recall if that data that doesn't change much at all, or doesn't frequently. For example, when we do some of the permission checks for the user, we don't expect them to be changing every minute or so, right? It basically obviously the backends have their own protection layer on this. Those are definitely verifying all the permissions. But on the web app, show you this control or not show you, we don't do it. Like, we just do it once and then maybe you refresh it in a day or so. And maybe you can show this cache data. Maybe it has time to live or expiration, when it will be expired, and past a certain point we do recall. So it all depends how fluid, how dynamic that data is, how long do you want to keep it, and also what are the drawbacks of showing the cache data to the user, how off-putting it could be, right?
For example, I think if it's a real-time application, for example, trading application, right? So I would prefer actually refetching it again, and of course it should be real-time. So you have to always keep in mind what kind of application you're working with.
Yeah, cool. That's a high extreme. The one I typically try to provide is, say, the products in the store, right? Do they change a lot? I mean, if it's Amazon, if it's my store that has 5 products that it sells, no, right? So those are the things. I don't have a store. I'm just imagining. Yeah.
Cool. So let's move on to the next question. I think we have a few more minutes. So while saving the data in state, right? So a lot of time developers are confused what kind of data we should save. So what is your answer to that?
What kind of data should we save?
Yeah.
So basically, you're determining what is a persistent layer, right? I mean, some data, client data that doesn't, like, is your tab open? Maybe it's important, maybe not. Maybe you can infer it from your URL itself, right? So that drives your thing. But other than that, I think the business requirements make it pretty clear, and you see what is a persistent one, what is not. One thing that I try to caution, maybe that's also within the application itself, is not to restore the state. Make sure you don't have a derived state basically weaving through your application. That one is really hard to change, especially when you update it. Now you just have to find all the places where you have a one place if that's a possibility. Yeah, so that's but what about what are you persisting? I think it's whatever you need and an app doesn't have. Whenever you need to display something app that doesn't have it, that's probably the one you want to persist. Some things could be persisted in a local store, maybe a local browser store. Which tab you open, if you don't have it as part of URL, maybe that's good enough there. Something like little things, because it's available instantly. It's a synchronous call and all that. So yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll come to the, I think, one question before we move ahead. So there is a lot of discussion around where to save JWT tokens. What is your preference? Local storage, session storage?
Yeah, don't save them. So only within the app's runtime. So once you close the browser, that should be gone. Yeah, don't save them. And you go to any of the auth providers, and this is the first thing they say: don't save it in your local storage kind of thing. Because extensions can get access to this and other things. Like you just don't want to be there. You don't want to be exposing your users to that.
Okay. So what is your preference? Where you will save it?
Just at the runtime of the application. So don't push it anywhere. Don't persist it to anything. Backends especially. I mean, yeah.
But you need to actually use JWT token for every other call, right? So it has to be saved somewhere at least.
Yeah, within the application state. So it could be the global state. If it's the token for the same service, right? If multiple ones, again, you'll probably index them and things like that. Yeah. So basically, and typically also that will be the tasks of the interceptors to make sure that those are still up to date. If it's expired, to request the new one, like all those stuff. This is the interceptor kind of logic and globally scoped.
Okay, so you will say, you are saying, okay, we can go ahead and save it in global scope and we can access it anywhere. Okay, cool. Okay, so we'll come to the last question, I think, and then we'll take some from chat. What are the best tools for state management for web?
What are the best state management tools for web? I would say probably about the Angular ones, because I am familiar somewhat with the other ones, but Angular is where my expertise is. I'm clearly not biased, but anyhow, what I wanted to say is that if you're using one of them and that works for you, that's great. Like, just use it, right? Just make sure you structure it and use it. There are multiple choices, and I would probably stick with the top three, right? Akita, NgXs, and NgRx, because they have good communities around them. So those are unlikely to go. If it's a one-off from a single author, that I would be definitely not recommending that, because again, you don't want to subject your application to those dangers. What I can say, for example, within Google, we use a single one, and that's NgRx. We can't use NgXs because of the decorators. It's just forbidden by our TypeScript team. Any decorators that are outside of built-in Angular ones, which are not really decorators, which is a whole different topic. We can't use even the effect doesn't. Effect decorator that we had, it still wasn't like a decorator. It was still doing some of the logic beforehand. So that one was safer, but we removed it now. I mean, it's still part of the framework, but we don't recommend it. And we basically, any new code bases, we definitely don't use it. So, and what's interesting is, NgRx or Akita, or Akita could also be used for some of the more local things. But now NgRx has a new library that's actually completely standalone, right? The component store. And that one is completely filling the gap that we had, because we had the global one, but we never had something that's tied to the components. And I think this edition should really be the first choice for anybody who's a big fan of service with a subject kind of approaches, saying, hey, I have raw RxJS that I can deal with my services in that, and I don't need any state management libraries. Now I think they have an option that's kind of a state management library, but and then again, somebody says, oh, I don't want another library to bring in. That library is basically a single file with 330 lines of code. You can look into it. It's basically aggregation of the best patterns. Every line of it is valuable and beneficial. There's no boilerplate. There's no things like that. But then it would help really organize your code and structure it in another level. Because when you deal with state management, then you also need to think of a different structure. How do I read from it? How do I update it? And how I handle my side effects within it. So those three things is clearly structured and organized, opinionated, very opinionated, but it's very focused on organizing that. So now with both of the solution, and again, you can use component store with Akita or NgXs as well. It doesn't matter. It's standalone, and you can combine data from multiple sources, no problem. So what I'm saying is this now fills that gap. And again, I'm clearly biased because I was working on this. But I think NgRx is definitely the safest from my side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's take some questions from the chat. So Nikhil has a question: with stateless service and cleaner service, does it mean we need to have middle service for component logic?
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, that's the right one. And this is the middle service. This is where most likely you'll have your library, like state management libraries, like be it globally scope NgRx or even component store. But also, like, actually, I feel like component store would be beneficial for any type of application, This is where you want to push your logic out. It could be one-to-one for a component for a specific one, because again, it ties into the life cycle. It's destroyed when the component is destroyed. It provides a reactive thing for it. It could be, for an individual component, it could be a UI layer logic, for example, aggregating some of the information from upstream in the component tree. For the higher ones, it would be the one that talks to the endpoints, and then that component store is the owner of the specific data that would be shared to the downstream component stores that provide that data to the components. So you would definitely have that layer, but it's a good layer to have. You want your services that do HTTP calls to be stateless, not much logic, but then these are the ones that are driving your business logic and all the things that you might want to handle, race conditions, call, like all of these things, and these are the ones that make it reactive, right? Because they will be providing those reactive properties.
Okay.
I think, did you have a chance to look into it, Santosh, and the component store at all? Or you've been pretty busy?
It's okay. We can look into that. I think there was some question as well. If we can look into.
No, I mean you personally, have you looked at it?
No, I have to still try it. I have to still try it out.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to another question. I think there was one from Vijay. Do you think component store is right candidate for micro frontend?
Component store for micro frontend. Yes. I mean, it's component store is it could be one of the smallest unit of the state management, right? And you can have multiple of them within the component tree, hopefully not at the provided and root level, because if you're just trying to put all the component stores in the provided root level, you are basically getting to the services that are stateful, just with the nicer API, maybe race conditioning, but still at the top level. And then you'll be injecting in your components multiple of them, and you are basically would get into the territory of which I call like a service soup, where you have multiple services using some of the services to combine it, which is not the situation you want to get into. You want to really see how the state flows within your component tree from top down, right? Don't create multiple services that are provided in a root. And again, this is my opinion on this. I see it as working, and we've been, again, component store we've been using within Firebase for roughly a year now. It became part of the NgXs and publicly released in August of this year. But before that, it was there and it works. We were just releasing 2 major features that are purely based on this. They are using some data from the global stores, but they're really, structured around the component store, and everybody's super excited to use them. And the feedback was positive. We just did a mini retrospective on this. Yeah, people love it.
Cool.
Okay.
So Oscar has a question. Is it possible to summarize new features of NgRx? Are we adding any new features?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So the whole new features of NgRx, I think NgRx now could be split up into the libraries more, right? Because when people say NgRx, what they typically mean is the global store, which was the thing that made NgRx popular, right? Now we have those 2 kind of independent but still working together things that still work well together. So component store is one of them for sure. We doing some of the minor things within effects, making create effect more stricter, like some of the things there are retriable, like we can provide the retry logic for error handling logic for your effects and all that. But most of them are like minor iterations. Angular is releasing their V11 soon, right? Because they just announced RC the other day. So we'll also be releasing version 11 probably within a month, like they would typically do. So we make sure that they're 100% compatible, like all the dependencies up to date. and we have like I have a few thoughts on some of the features, but probably won't name them because they're I don't want to commit and not deliver. Yeah, so there are a few things, but component stores I would definitely look at this. The other thing is NgXs component that was also released in August. That one is highly experimental feature, and I can't stress it enough. That one is highly experimental feature. Basically, use at your own risk. We see a different approach for the future for zoneless. So that one, play around with it. I would recommend NgRx component to be used in production. But basically, yeah, you can experiment with that.
Okay, that's cool. Cool. So I think we are done, Alex. So last thing, do you want to promote something on our channel? So
promote.
yeah.
I don't know. I'd like to have this conversation around state and things like that. Definitely join the discords. Have any questions, or if you can share some expertise, or you have some feedback, share it. I'm very interested in the feedback. I'd like to see, because again, before releasing component store and fine tuning it, I've been part of the very ingrained in the many part of the different communities, even the Russian speaking ones, Antosh, there's in there as well, and any other ones that I could find, because I wanted to see, what our people problems are, what the dislikes were, and things like that. And after, we fine tuned it and release it, I want to get the feedback back, right? Because I want to see this, that actually solves a problem. Sometimes the feedback is, yeah, that's kind of awesome. I didn't look at it too deep, but actually it doesn't work for me. And like, okay, let's see why it doesn't work, right? And what typically happens is, at the end of the day, after some conversations, they're like, oh, I see, yeah, it's awesome. I actually gonna try to use it in my next app or start to rate this. Especially people who are like really, really hardcore, like, hey, I just need my service and my Redux.js, and I can do miracles with them. And this is great because this one is just helps you organize it a little bit, so you don't have to repeat all those things every time. Yeah,
that's cool. So okay, I'll just add the links in the description later on, so you can refer the Angular Discord, NgRx Discord, as well as the NgRx talks. And of course, I'll play around this component store, because I wanted to do from a long time, and finally I think I will get some time next week.
I'll be doing the workshop. It's a one-day workshop in the NG Poland. And again, now I'm basically jamming 3 days of workshop into a single day. So the workshop would be mostly me talking and going over things. It'll still be going over the code. It's typically a full day of me talking, but then you have all the materials, you have the slides and all that stuff, and all the explanation as I go through it. So that one is a paid one. So if you do want to join that one, go ahead. That'll be happening in end of November. I think November 20th.
Yeah, 19th and 20th.
Yeah, so somewhere over there. I will be probably doing the full hands-on, maybe like 3 days with you can actually do this on my own as well. I haven't scheduled that. Maybe end of year, maybe beginning of the year. I'll be doing that one. But for now, the Poland one would definitely be probably a best option if you really want to get with me on this, so I can go in very much details and explain it.
That's cool. So I'll just add the link. I think it is still not announced, if I'm not wrong, because
it's announced. It's announced.
Okay.
It's there.
Okay. So I'll just add the link as well. So if someone is interested, you can for sure actually join that workshop. So yeah. So I think that's it. Thanks a lot, Alex, for your time, and it was like really interesting conversation to have. And on closing notes, I'll just add, I mean, we reached to 500 subscribers today, so I'm really happy.
Nice.
And thanks a lot to everyone.
Congratulations, Santosh.
Always
definitely deserve it.
Thanks a lot, Alex. So that's for the day. And for next week we have another guest, and for next week we have a different topic altogether. We will be talking about Vue.js, and we'll be talking about White, so which is like another web tool which is available. And the next guest is Elise. I'm sure I'm pronouncing the name correctly. So Elise recently joined in depth, and she actually agreed to talk about Vue.js and White, and I was really interested because I wanted to explore a little bit of Vue as well. So next Friday, same time, and we will have Elise with us.
Oh, can't wait for that one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, so bye everyone, and see you next week. And I'll just update the description, so you can maybe probably look at that tomorrow, and it will be available, and you can refer all the links which we discussed about. Thank you. Bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye.